The grand hall of the HFY compact was built to make small things feel smaller. Its ceiling rose so high that clouds sometimes formed near the top and drifted lazily above the heads of the delegates below. Pillars of black stone, carved by 6 different species over 6,000 years, held up a roof shaped like the wings of some ancient bird. In the center of the hall stood the circle of seats, one for every member species of the compact, arranged so that the strongest empires sat closest to the throne of the first speaker, and the weakest sat near the doors, where the wind was cold and the light was dim. There was one seat that nobody sat in. It was not empty because it was cursed, or broken, or forgotten. It was empty because the species it belonged to had never once, in 20 years of knowing about the compact, sent anyone to sit in it. The seat was carved from pale stone, plain and unremarkable next to its glittering neighbors, and it bore a small plaque that read, in the old trade language, Earth. Ambassador Doreen Vance of Ohio State stood outside the Grand Hall for the first time in her life and looked up at the doors, which were 40 feet tall and made of a metal that hummed faintly when touched. She was not nervous. She had told herself this on the shuttle down from orbit, and she told herself again now, straightening her plain gray jacket, the one with no medals, no rank markers, nothing but a small pin shaped like a compass over her heart. "They will ask you to kneel," said Tobrun, the HFY liaison walking beside her. He was tall, nearly 8 feet, with skin like poured bronze, and 4 eyes set in a face that never seemed to blink all at once. It is customary, when a new species is presented before the circle, they bow to the first speaker, and then to the 3 elder houses. It is a formality. It costs nothing. "I know," Doreen said. "And yet your people have refused this formality for 20 years, Tobrun said. There was no anger in his voice, only a kind of tired curiosity, the voice of someone who had asked the same question many times and never gotten an answer that satisfied him. "Every ambassador we have sent to your world has returned with the same message. Humanity does not bow. Humanity will trade. Humanity will speak. Humanity will even fight, if it must. But humanity will not bow. Why?" Doreen thought about how to answer that. She thought about her grandmother, who used to tell her stories about a war that had almost ended the world, back before the stars had opened up to human ships. She thought about the history books she had read as a girl, thick with names of kings and tyrants, and the long, slow, bloody work of pulling free from them. She thought about the Declaration of Independence, and the storming of prisons, and the marches, and the votes, and the wars fought not to conquer anyone but simply to be left alone to govern themselves. "Because we already tried it," she said finally. "Bowing, I mean. We spent most of our history bowing to someone, kings, emperors, warlords, gods that turned out to be men in fancy hats. It never worked out well for us. Every time we bowed, someone found a way to make us bow lower. So a long time ago, we decided to stop. All of us. It took centuries, but we stopped. And once you stop, you don't start again. Not for anyone. Not even for people who could crush our whole planet with a single ship." Tobrun's 4 eyes blinked in sequence, which Doreen had learned was the HFY equivalent of raised eyebrows. Even the first speaker commands the fleets of 900 worlds. "He has ended civilizations with a single order, and you would refuse him a simple bow?" "We'd refuse him a simple bow," Doreen agreed. "We'd shake his hand, though. We'd sit at his table and talk trade routes and star charts all day long. We'd help him if his people were starving. We'd fight beside him if some third party attacked us both. But we won't kneel. Not to him, not to anyone. That's the whole rule. It's not complicated. It's just unbreakable." The great doors opened. Inside, the circle of seats was already filling. Doreen recognized some of the delegates from briefing files, the insectile Kravus, whose queens communicated through clicking sounds too fast for human ears to follow without translation implants. The pale, floating Ulun, who lived their entire lives in gel tanks mounted on hovering platforms. The reptilian Sassoth, proud and quick to anger, who had fought 3 wars with the Compact before finally submitting to its rule. Doreen had read that the Sassoth still resented their submission, even generations later. Every year, on the anniversary of their surrender, Sassoth younglings were made to bow before statues of the first speaker's ancestors, so that they would never forget their place. At the far end of the hall, on a raised dais that put him 15 feet above every seated delegate, sat the first speaker himself. He was HFY, like Tobrun, but old in a way that made his bronze skin look like tarnished metal, and his 4 eyes had the flat, patient look of someone who had outlived several of his own children. He wore no crown, no obvious symbol of office, because he did not need one. Everyone in the room knew who he was, and everyone in the room, without exception, had bowed to him at some point in their lives. Except, Doreen thought, walking down the long central aisle, with her boots clicking against the black stone floor, me. She reached the center of the circle, where a small speaking platform waited for her, and stopped. She did not kneel. She did not bow her head. She stood straight, hands loose at her sides, and looked up at the first speaker, the way she would look at anyone else she had just met. A murmur went through the hall. It was not loud, but in a room built to carry the softest whisper to every corner. It did not need to be. Ambassador Vance, the first speaker said. His voice was translated into her earpiece, a half-second after he spoke, deep and slow, like stone grinding against stone. You stand before the circle of the HFY Compact for the first time. Do you understand the customs of this hall? I do, Doreen said. Then you understand that all who stand here bow before speaking. It is not a request. It is the shape of this room. It has been the shape of this room for 6,000 years. I understand that it's your custom, Doreen said. I respect that it means something to you and to everyone else standing here. But it's not our custom, and it never will be. My people sent me here to speak with you, first speaker, not to kneel in front of you. If speaking requires kneeling, then I'm afraid we have nothing further to discuss, and I'll be on the next shuttle back to my ship. The murmur grew louder. Somewhere to her left, a Sassoth delegate hissed through his teeth, a sound Doreen's earpiece helpfully translated as something close to outrage. To her right, one of the Ulun's gel tanks bubbled rapidly, which Tobrun had told her earlier was the equivalent of nervous laughter. The first speaker held up one hand, and the hall fell silent. 20 years, he said. 20 years since our scouts first found your world, sitting quietly at the edge of known space, broadcasting nothing, hiding nothing, simply living. 20 years since we extended the hand of the compact to your species, as we have to every species we have found capable of reaching the stars. 20 years, and in all that time, not a single human being has bowed in this hall. Do you know how many species have joined the compact in that same span, Ambassador? I don't, Doreen admitted. 6, the first speaker said. 6 new species have taken their seats in this circle since your world was discovered. 6 species who understood that a small bow of the head costs nothing and buys everything. Protection, trade, the wisdom of 1,000 civilizations, freedom from war. And your people, alone among all of them, have refused this simple gesture for 2 entire decades. Why do you insist on making things so difficult for yourselves, Ambassador Vance? Doreen took a breath. This was the moment, she knew, that every ambassador before her had reached and failed to pass. 3 of them had come before her over the years, and each had eventually given up, either bowing in a moment of weakness that had shamed them back on Earth, or storming out and souring relations for years. She was determined to be neither. First speaker, she said, may I tell you a story? The old HFY's eyes blinked, all 4 in a slow ripple. Stories are welcome in this hall, Ambassador. It has heard many. A long time ago, Doreen said, on my world, there was a man who called himself the Son of Heaven. He ruled over 1/5 of humanity, and every single person under his rule was required, by law, to bow before him. Not just bow, but press their forehead to the ground, again and again, whenever they saw him, or even spoke his name. Anyone who refused was killed, sometimes along with their entire family. This went on for thousands of years, dynasty after dynasty, different families, same rule, bow or die. She let that sit for a moment. And on the other side of my world, there were kings who called themselves chosen by God. If you didn't bow to them, they'd say you were denying God himself, and then they'd burn you, or hang you, or throw you in a dungeon and forget you existed. And in another place, there were emperors who painted themselves gold and made whole nations kneel in the mud in front of them, while they rode by on decorated horses. This is not ancient history to us, first speaker. This is recent. My own grandmother's grandmother lived under rulers like this. It is close enough to touch. And your species learned to bow, the first speaker said, as all species eventually do. We learned to bow, Doreen agreed. And then, slowly, over centuries, in dozens of countries, in 100 different revolutions, we learned something else. We learned that every single time we bowed, it made the next demand easier for whoever we bowed to. Bow to the king, and soon he wants your taxes. Give him your taxes, and soon he wants your sons for his wars. Give him your sons, and soon he wants your daughters too, and your land, and your voice. And eventually your name isn't even your own anymore. It never stops at one bow, first speaker. Not once, in the whole history of my species, has it ever stopped at one bow. The hall was very quiet now. So somewhere along the way, Doreen continued, different groups of us, in different places, speaking different languages, all arrived at the same conclusion, without ever comparing notes. We decided that no bow was safe. Not one. Not even a small one. Not even a friendly one. Not even one that costs nothing and means nothing to the person receiving it. Because we know, we have the scars to prove it, that the first bow is never the last. So we stopped, all of us. Every nation on earth, one by one, over about 200 years, we stopped bowing to kings and emperors and gods in human skin. We built governments where the person in charge has to answer to the people, not the other way around. And once a species has bled for that freedom the way we have, first speaker, it does not hand it back. Not to a king, not to an emperor, not to a first speaker with 900 worlds behind him. Even if it costs you everything, the first speaker asked, and for the first time, his voice had lost its grinding, patient quality. There was something sharper underneath it now. Even then, Doreen said, we'll trade with you. We'll learn from you. We'll fight beside you against anyone who threatens both our peoples. We'll open our world to your scholars, and send our own scholars to study at your universities. We want to be part of this galaxy, first speaker. Truly, we do. But we will be part of it standing up. That seat you've kept for us all these years, we're grateful for it. We really are. But it's going to stay empty, until you understand that we're not refusing to sit in it because we don't respect you. We're refusing because sitting in it, the way your customs demand, would mean becoming something we spent our entire history trying to stop being. For a long moment, nobody in the grand hall said anything. Doreen could hear her own heartbeat, could hear the faint hum of the metal doors far behind her, could hear the soft bubbling of the Ulan's gel tanks, and the dry rasp of Sassoth breathing. Then the first speaker did something that made every delegate in the circle sit up straight in shock. He rose from his throne, all 15 feet above the floor of the dais, and descended the stairs himself, something Doreen would later learn he had not done in front of the full circle, in over 300 years. He crossed the black stone floor until he stood before her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet all four of his eyes. 6,000 years, he said quietly, so quietly that Doreen suspected the translation was only picking up because he wanted her, specifically, to hear it. 6,000 years this compact has stood, and in all that time, no species has ever spoken to me the way you have just spoken, in front of everyone, without kneeling, without flinching, without softening a single word to spare my pride. Do you know what that tells me, Ambassador Vance? No, first speaker, Doreen said honestly. It tells me, he said, that your people either have no sense of self-preservation whatsoever, or that you understand something about power that the rest of this circle forgot a very long time ago. He paused. I intend to find out which. I am recalling the fleet stationed at your system's border, effective today, and I am inviting you, not commanding, inviting, to remain here, in the Compact's capital as our guest, so that we might continue this conversation properly. Would that be acceptable to your people, Ambassador? Doreen felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized was tight. Around the circle, delegates were staring, some in confusion, some in open fear, and one, the Sassoth ambassador, she noticed, in something that looked almost like grudging respect. That would be more than acceptable, first speaker, she said. Thank you. Do not thank me yet, the first speaker said, And for the first time since she had entered the hall, something that might have been the ghost of a smile touched his ancient bronze face. There are those in this compact who will not be pleased that Earth's seat remains empty, nor that I have chosen to indulge your species' stubbornness instead of ending it. The Sassoth Empire in particular has long argued that any species which will not bow should not be permitted to remain free at all. You have made a friend today, Ambassador Vance. You have also, I suspect, made an enemy. Doreen looked past him, toward the Sassoth delegation, and found the ambassador already watching her, his reptilian eyes narrow and calculating. She held his gaze without blinking, the same way she had held the first speakers. We're used to that too, she said. Far above them, through the great domed ceiling of the grand hall, the light of a distant sun shifted, and somewhere out past the edge of the compact's charted space, 3 days' travel away, a Sassoth war fleet that had been quietly gathering for the past 6 months received new orders and began, very slowly, to change course. Later that evening, Doreen was given quarters near the top of one of Thrennis's residential spires, a small room with a wide window that looked out over the endless curve of the station and the red dying star it circled. She sat by that window for a long time without turning on the lights, running the day's events over and over in her mind, the way she always did, after a difficult negotiation, searching for the moment she had said too much, or too little, or the wrong thing entirely. She could not find one. That, more than anything, was what finally let her sleep. Tobrun came to see her the next morning, carrying a small tray of food that Doreen recognized, gratefully, as something close enough to bread and fruit that her stomach didn't rebel at the sight of it. You slept, he observed, setting the tray down. That surprises me. Most new ambassadors do not sleep at all after their first appearance before the circle, win or lose. I've had practice not sleeping, Doreen said, thinking of the years before this posting, the long committee hearings back on Earth, the endless debates in the Unified Council about whether sending an ambassador to the stars was even wise, given how many species out there might simply see humanity's stubborn independence as a threat to be removed rather than a virtue to be respected. This wasn't the hardest room I've ever had to stand in front of. No? Tobrun's 4 eyes blinked with interest. What was? A congressional subcommittee back home, about 15 years ago, Doreen said, allowing herself a small, tired smile. Trying to explain to a room full of very frightened, very powerful people why sending someone to represent Earth among the stars wouldn't automatically get our planet conquered. Half of them wanted to hide, build bigger walls, stronger shields, go quiet, and hope nobody found us. The other half wanted to come out swinging, arm every ship we had, and dare the galaxy to try something. It took years to convince enough of them that there was a third option. Show up. Be honest about who we are. Don't hide. And don't posture. Just be exactly what we've always tried to be, and let the chips fall where they may. And here you are, Tobrun said. Here I am, Doreen agreed. She thought, not for the first time, about how strange it was that the very people who had almost destroyed Earth generations ago, kings, tyrants, dictators who had made whole populations kneel in the mud, had ultimately given humanity the thing it needed most to survive first contact with a much larger, much older galaxy. Not weapons, not wealth, not even the collected wisdom of 100 sciences, just a bone-deep, hard-won refusal to ever again let anyone else decide what humanity was allowed to be. It was a strange inheritance, she thought, born from centuries of suffering, and yet here it was, carrying her people forward into the stars, with a kind of quiet, unshakable confidence that even the oldest species in the compact seemed to find both baffling and, if the first speaker's reaction was any indication, unexpectedly compelling. Over the following weeks, that confidence was tested again and again, in smaller ways than the Grand Hall but no less real. A trade delegation from a species called the Voraxi attempted, twice, to insert clauses into a proposed agreement that would have required human representatives to address Voraxi nobility, using honorifics reserved for social inferiors. And both times, Doreen's team simply struck the clauses without comment and continued negotiating as though nothing unusual had happened. A junior compact administrator once tried to seat Doreen at a lower table during a diplomatic dinner, behind delegations from species who had only joined the compact 5 years earlier, and Doreen had, without any anger at all, simply picked up her plate, walked to an open seat at the main table, and continued the conversation she'd been having, as though she'd never been anywhere else. Word of these small, quiet refusals spread through Threnis almost as quickly as word of her speech, before the circle had, and slowly, a kind of grudging respect began to take root among delegations who had never quite known what to make of humanity before. Not every reaction was respect, though. Doreen noticed in those same weeks how carefully the Sassoth delegation avoided her, how their eyes followed her across crowded halls with an expression she had learned, from long practice reading unfamiliar faces, was not curiosity at all, but something colder and more calculating. She mentioned it to Tobrun once, in passing, and his 4 eyes had gone very still for a moment before he answered. "The Sassoth do not forget insults, real or imagined," he said quietly. "And to a species raised on stories of their own ancestors' submission, a species that refuses to submit at all, must feel like more than an insult. It must feel like a question they have spent 300 years trying not to ask themselves." Doreen had not understood, then, quite how right he was. She would understand soon enough. 3 months passed on the Compact's capital world, a ring-shaped station called Threnis, that circled a dying red star, and in that time, Doreen Vance became something she had never expected to become, a curiosity. Delegates from species she had never heard of before her arrival began requesting meetings with her, not for trade, not for politics, but simply to see, up close, the human who had refused to bow to the first speaker and lived to tell of it. She met with insect queens and gel tank philosophers, and a species of 6-limbed nomads who lived their entire lives aboard drifting ships and had never once touched solid ground. Every single one of them asked her some version of the same question: "Why does your species refuse to bow?" And every single time, she gave some version of the same answer, until the words felt worn smooth in her mouth like river stones. But not everyone on Threnis was curious. Some were furious. The Sassoth delegation kept its distance from her, mostly, but she felt their attention on her whenever she moved through the station's public halls, a cold, reptilian watchfulness that never quite turned into open hostility, but never fully relaxed either. She learned, through careful listening and the occasional slip from friendlier delegates, that the Sassoth had once been proud conquerors themselves, an empire that had swallowed 4 neighboring worlds before the Compact's combined fleets had finally broken them, 300 years ago. Since then, every Sassoth child was raised on stories of that defeat, taught that submission to the Compact was the price of survival, and taught, above all, that a species which refused to submit was not brave. It was reckless, and recklessness, in the long history of the galaxy, tended to get entire worlds burned. Doreen was in the middle of a trade briefing with a Crevice delegation. She had grown fond of the insectile queens, who communicated in rapid clicks and had a surprisingly sharp sense of humor once you got past the translation lag. When Tobrun found her, his 4 eyes wide with something that looked, on his usually composed face, dangerously close to alarm. "Ambassador," he said, "the first speaker requests your presence immediately. There has been an incident." "What kind of incident?" "A Sassoth scout ship was found inside your home system's outer boundary 2 days ago," Tobrun said, keeping his voice low as they walked. "It was destroyed by one of your automated defense platforms before it could withdraw. The Sassoth are calling it an act of war." Doreen's stomach dropped. Was it actually a scout ship, or was it something else? "That," Tobrun said grimly, "is precisely what the first speaker wishes to discuss with you." The Grand Hall felt different this time. There was no ceremony, no gathered circle, only the first speaker himself, seated not on his high dais, but at a long table in a smaller chamber behind it, along with 3 compact military officers Doreen didn't recognize, and, seated across from them with his arms folded and his reptilian eyes burning, the Sassoth ambassador. "Ambassador Vance," the first speaker said, "thank you for coming quickly. I believe you already know Ambassador Kresh of the Sassoth Empire." "We've met," Doreen said carefully, taking the offered seat. Kresh did not waste time on pleasantries. 2 days ago, he said, his voice a low hiss even through the translation, a Sassoth vessel on a routine survey mission was destroyed without warning, by human weapons inside your system. 16 of my people died. I am here to demand an explanation and reparations from a species that claims it fights no wars of conquest, yet murders survey crews without provocation. Show me the data, Doreen said. One of the military officers slid a data tablet across the table. Doreen studied it for a long moment, and something in her chest went cold and very still. The particular stillness she had learned, over years of diplomatic work, meant she needed to choose her next words with extreme care. This wasn't a survey ship, she said finally. You would say that, Kresh snapped. I'd say it because it's true, and because I can prove it, Doreen said. This ship's flight profile matches a stealth reconnaissance pattern, not a survey pattern. It approached from a blind angle relative to our sensor network. It was running with minimal power signature, and it altered course 3 times to avoid detection before our platform picked it up. Survey ships don't do that, Ambassador Kresh. Spy ships do. An unfounded accusation, Kresh said, but Doreen noticed his tail, visible beneath the table's edge, had gone very still, the reptilian equivalent, she had learned, of a held breath. It's not unfounded. It's on the sensor logs, which I'm happy to share with the full circle, if you'd like this discussed publicly instead of in this room, Doreen said. Here's what I think actually happened. I think your empire has been gathering fleet assets near our border for the past several months. Yes, we've noticed. First speaker, we're not blind, and I think this ship was sent to probe our defenses ahead of some larger operation you're planning. And I think it got caught, and now you're trying to turn your own reconnaissance failure into a diplomatic weapon against us. Am I close, Ambassador Kresh? The chamber went very quiet. The first speaker's 4 eyes moved slowly from Doreen to Kresh and back again, unreadable. You dare accuse the Sassoth Empire of preparing an unprovoked attack, Kresh said, his voice dropping even lower, based on nothing but your own paranoid speculation. I dare accuse you of it, Doreen said, because 16 deaths on a spy mission that got caught is a real tragedy, and I'm genuinely sorry for it. Truly, I don't say that lightly, but it doesn't change what your ship was doing there, and I think everyone in this room already knows that, including you. Kresh rose so fast his chair scraped back across the floor with a shriek of metal on stone. The Sassoth Empire does not answer to accusations from a species too proud to even kneel before its betters. Perhaps this is the lesson your people need. First speaker, a demonstration of what happens to those who refuse the order of things. My empire has fought this compact before, and we can fight it again. And this time, we would not be fighting alone. There are others who resent how far this circle has bent itself out of shape to accommodate one arrogant, unbowed species. Sit down, Ambassador Kresh, the first speaker said, and though his voice did not rise, something in it made even Doreen's skin prickle. You forget yourself. Kresh did not sit, but he did stop talking, his jaw working silently for a moment, before he finally lowered himself back into his chair, radiating fury. I will say this once, to both of you, the first speaker continued. The compact does not go looking for wars, and it does not tolerate them being started under its roof. Ambassador Kresh, if your empire has been massing forces near the human system, I want a full accounting of it within 3 days, or I will consider it, myself, an act of aggression against a species currently under this compact's protection. Yes, Ambassador Vance, protection, whether your people asked for it or not, because I extended it the moment I recalled our border fleet and invited you to remain here. And Ambassador Vance, he turned to her, and for a moment, something almost like sympathy crossed his ancient face. Your species has made a great many admirers on Threnis these past 3 months, he said. You have also, as I warned you, made enemies, and I fear this incident is only the beginning of what those enemies intend. I would ask you to return home, not because I wish to be rid of you, but because if the Sassoth Empire is indeed preparing for war, your people will need their ambassador beside them, not 8 days' travel away on a station that cannot lift a finger to defend you if it comes to that. Doreen felt the weight of that settle over her. 8 days' travel. If Kresh's fleet was already moving, 8 days could be the difference between arriving home to a tense standoff and arriving home to a graveyard. I'll leave within the hour, she said. The journey back to Earth felt longer than it had any right to feel, even with the compact's faster-than-light drive technology humming beneath her feet the entire way. Doreen spent most of it in the small ship's communications room, sending encrypted updates back to the unified Earth Council, reading intelligence reports as they trickled in from the handful of human scout vessels stationed along the border, and trying, without much success, to sleep. The reports were not good. Sassoth fleet movements had increased sharply over the past 2 weeks. Not the scattered patrols of a species simply defending its own space, but the coordinated buildup of a force preparing to strike. Estimates put the gathering fleet at somewhere between 200 and 300 warships, a number that made Doreen's throat go dry every time she read it, because Earth, for all its stubborn pride, had perhaps 40 capital ships in its entire defense fleet, most of them built in the last decade, specifically because humanity had never fully trusted the goodwill of the wider galaxy. She thought about her grandmother again, on that long flight home, about the stories of the old wars, the ones fought with nuclear weapons and firebombing, and the kind of hatred that could level whole cities in an afternoon. Humanity had nearly destroyed itself twice in 1 century, and it was only after the second time, after millions had died and continents had burned, that the world's nations had finally, exhaustedly, come together and agreed on something simple. Never again would humanity kneel to a tyrant, and never again would humanity become one. It was a beautiful principle. It had also, Doreen thought grimly, never once been tested against an alien war fleet 300 ships strong. When her shuttle finally broke atmosphere over the eastern seaboard of what had once been called North America, now simply the Unified Assembly District, she was met on the landing pad not by a formal escort, but by General Marcus Reyes himself, commander of Earth's combined defense fleet, a broad-shouldered man in his 60s with iron-gray hair and the kind of tired, watchful eyes that came from 30 years of preparing for a war he had always hoped would never come. "Ambassador," he said, shaking her hand firmly, "welcome home. I wish it were under better circumstances. How bad is it, Marcus?" "Bad," he said, walking with her toward the waiting transport. Sassoth fleet still gathering at the border, no sign of pulling back, despite the first speaker's demand for an accounting. "Our best intelligence puts their strength at 280 ships now, and growing by the day. If they come, Doreen, we're looking at a fight we cannot win on numbers alone." "Then we don't fight on numbers alone," Doreen said. "We never have." Reyes gave her a long look, the kind of look old soldiers gave when they were deciding whether to share a hard truth or a comforting lie. He chose the hard truth, because that was who he was, and it was why the Unified Council had trusted him with the fleet in the first place. "I hope you're right," he said, "because if you're wrong, Doreen, there won't be a seat left empty at that circle. There won't be anyone left to sit in it." Doreen looked up at the darkening sky, where somewhere far beyond the visible stars, a fleet of alien warships sat coiled at the edge of human space, waiting for an order that could end everything humanity had spent centuries building. She thought about the empty seat in the Grand Hall, about the plain pale stone with its small plaque, and about the 200 years of blood and revolution and stubborn, unbreakable pride that had put it there. "I'm not wrong," she said quietly. "We didn't come this far by bowing. We're not about to start now." But even as she said it, she felt the first cold thread of real fear settle into her chest, because she knew, better than anyone standing on that landing pad, that pride alone had never once stopped a war fleet from opening fire. The transport ride into the Unified Council's underground command center took nearly an hour, and Doreen spent most of it watching the darkening city slide past the vehicle's windows, ordinary people going about ordinary evenings, utterly unaware that somewhere far above the atmosphere they walked beneath, a decision was being made that could decide whether any of this, the lit windows, the quiet streets, the small, unremarkable business of simply being alive, would still exist in a matter of weeks. "You've been quiet," Reyes said, glancing over at her. "I'm thinking about what happens if I'm wrong," Doreen admitted. "Not about the principle. I still believe in the principle, Marcus. I'll believe in it until the day I die. I'm thinking about whether I misjudged how far the Sassoth are willing to go to prove a point. Kresh didn't strike me as reckless in that meeting. He struck me as someone who'd already decided exactly how far he was willing to go, and was simply waiting for the right moment to go there. Then we make sure the moment never comes on his terms," Reyes said. "That's the whole job now. Not proving a philosophical point, making sure we're standing on the other side of this to keep arguing it." When they reached the command center, buried 300 meters beneath what had once been called the Rocky Mountains, Doreen found the atmosphere far more subdued than she had expected. She had pictured chaos, shouting, officers running between stations with the kind of frantic energy she associated with old films about wars fought entirely on Earth's own surface. Instead, she found quiet, focused activity. Dozens of analysts and officers moving between screens with the calm, practiced efficiency of people who had spent years preparing for exactly this scenario, hoping all the while that the preparation would never actually be needed. We've had contingency plans for a compact-scale conflict since before you were even posted to Threnis, Reyes explained, leading her past rows of tactical displays toward the central planning table. Nobody wanted to believe we'd ever need them, but your predecessor's briefings made it clear early on that first contact could go one of several ways, and not all of them were friendly. So we planned, quietly, without much hope we'd ever use any of it. And now? And now I'm very glad we did, Reyes said grimly, pulling up the latest fleet composition estimates on the central display. Doreen, I need you to understand something before this goes any further. What we're facing isn't a fleet that thinks it might lose. Sassoth doctrine, from everything our analysts have pieced together over the years, treats overwhelming force as a moral argument, as much as a military one. To them, a fleet this size isn't just meant to defeat us. It's meant to prove, beyond any possible doubt, that resistance was always going to be futile. That's a dangerous kind of enemy to face, because it means they're not just fighting to win, they're fighting to make a point stick for the next 300 years. Then we need to make sure the point that sticks is ours, not theirs, Doreen said. Over the following days, as the Sassoth fleet continued to gather at the border and the Unified Council debated its response late into every night, Doreen found herself returning again and again to conversations she'd had on Threnis, trying to piece together anything that might give humanity an edge beyond simple stubbornness. She thought of the Kravis queen who had shown genuine warmth toward her during trade talks, of the Ulan philosophers who had seemed almost delighted by humanity's insistence on doing things its own strange, difficult way. She began reaching out quietly, through back channels Tobran had helped her establish before she left Threnis, hoping that somewhere among the Compact's many species, there might be others willing to speak up on Earth's behalf if the worst came to pass. Most of those messages went unanswered, or received only cautious, non-committal replies. Nobody wanted to be seen taking sides against the Sassoth Empire before a single shot had been fired. But one message, from the Kravis queen Doreen had spoken with most often during her months on Threnis, came back within hours, short but unmistakably genuine. I have not forgotten your kindness, Ambassador. Whatever comes, know that not every eye in this compact is closed to what is happening to your people. It was not a promise of help, Doreen understood that. But in the tense, uncertain days that followed, as intelligence reports grew steadily worse, and the Sassoth fleet showed no sign of standing down, that single short message became something she returned to, again and again. A small, stubborn thread of hope in the growing dark. The Unified Council chamber in Geneva had not been this full in a generation. Every seat was taken, delegates from every nation on Earth crowded shoulder to shoulder, and the air hummed with the particular tension of people who understood, all at once, that history was about to turn a corner, and there was no telling which way it would bend. Doreen stood at the podium, General Reyes beside her, and laid out everything she knew. The empty seat, the first speaker's warning, the Sassoth fleet, now confirmed at 290 warships, and still growing, sitting 11 light hours from Earth's outer defense line. When she finished, the chamber was silent for a long moment, before the questions began, sharp and fast, from 100 directions at once. Should we bow? Asked the delegate from what had once been called France, an older woman named Dr. Aline Mercier, though she asked it not as a demand but as a genuine, painful question, the kind that needed to be asked even if everyone in the room already knew the answer. If it saves lives, if it buys us time to build a real defense, should we simply give them the gesture they want? No, said the delegate from Nigeria, before Doreen could even open her mouth. We are not having this conversation again. We had it in 2041. We had it in 2089. We are not having it in this century too. Easy for you to say when it's not your children under the flight paths of those warships. someone else called out, and the chamber erupted into overlapping arguments, voices rising, old wounds and older fears surfacing all at once. Doreen let it run for almost a full minute before she raised her hand for silence, and slowly, the chamber quieted. "I understand the fear," she said. "I've felt it myself, every hour since I left Threnis. But I want to remind everyone in this room of something. The first speaker didn't ask us to bow. He recalled his own border fleet the moment we refused. He's not the threat. The Sassoth Empire is threatening us because they resent that the Compact bent its own rules to accommodate a species that won't kneel, not because they think one bow from us would actually fix anything. Ambassador Kresh made that very clear. He doesn't want our submission. He wants an excuse to prove that submission is the only thing that keeps species like us alive. If we bow now, out of fear, we don't buy ourselves safety. We prove Kresh's entire argument right, and we hand him a propaganda victory that will follow us for the rest of our history among the stars." "So what do you propose instead?" Dr. Mercier asked. "Because we won't bow is a principle, Ambassador. It is not a defense fleet." "No," Doreen admitted. "It isn't. That's why General Reyes is here." Reyes stepped up to the podium, and the chamber's attention shifted to him, the room quieting further as one of Earth's most trusted military minds began to speak. "We can't win a straight fight against 300 Sassoth warships," he said bluntly. "I won't stand here and tell this council otherwise. Ship for ship, gun for gun, they outmatch us badly. And everyone in this room needs to understand that clearly before we decide anything else. But," he paused, letting that word sit in the air, "we're not going to fight them, ship for ship, gun for gun. We're going to fight them the way humanity has always fought when the numbers were against us. Smart, stubborn, and using every piece of ground we know better than the enemy does." He brought up a star map on the chamber's main display, the human system rendered in soft blue light, its outer defense line marked in a thin red arc. "Our system has 7 major asteroid belts, 3 gas giants with dozens of moons between them, and an asteroid density in our outer system that most compact species consider a navigation hazard. They simply route around," Reyes said. "The Sassoth fleet doctrine, from everything our intelligence has gathered, favors large formations, coordinated volley fire, overwhelming force delivered in open space where their numbers matter most. They are not built, or trained, for a fight fought in a debris field where a 200-ship formation becomes a liability instead of an advantage." "You want to draw them into the asteroid belts," someone said. "I want to make them choose between fighting on our terms, in terrain that neutralizes their numbers, or sitting outside it indefinitely, while their own logistics chain, 11 light hours from home, starts to strain," Reyes said. "Every day, they wait. They burn fuel and supplies they can't easily replace out here. Every day they wait. More of the Compact's neutral species start watching this standoff and asking uncomfortable questions about why the Sassoth Empire is threatening a species that's done nothing but refuse a bow. Kresh doesn't want a long siege, council members. He wants a fast, decisive strike that proves his point before the rest of the galaxy has time to object. If we deny him that fast strike, we deny him the whole argument." "And if he strikes anyway?" Dr. Mercier asked quietly. "If he decides the cost is worth it." Reyes's face went grim. "Then we make him pay so dearly for every kilometer of ground he takes that even his own government back home starts asking whether it was worth it. I won't promise this council a bloodless war. I won't promise a war we're guaranteed to win outright. What I will promise is that we make Earth the single worst decision the Sassoth Empire has made in 300 years, and we do it without kneeling to a single one of them." The vote, when it finally came near midnight, was not unanimous. Nothing involving humanity had ever been fully unanimous, Doreen thought wryly. That was rather the point of them, but it was overwhelming. 94 nations in favor of standing firm, of trusting the defense plan, of refusing, once again, across the long, unbroken thread of human history, to bow. 3 days later, word came from an unexpected source. Doreen was in the Unified Council's communications hub, going over the latest fleet deployment reports with Reyes, when one of the young communications officers came rushing in, her face pale. "Ambassador, General, we're receiving an encrypted transmission. It's compact origin, but it's not from Threnis. It's routing through a relay we don't recognize. Put it through, Doreen said. The face that appeared on the display was not the first speaker, nor anyone from the HFY compact leadership Doreen had met. It was a crevice queen, one of the insectile delegates Doreen had befriended during her months on Threnis. Her chitinous features rendered strangely gentle by the translation software's attempt to convey emotion across such an alien face. Ambassador Vance, the queen clicked, the translation arriving a half-beat later. Forgive the irregular channel. I did not wish this message traced back to my hive court. I am transmitting from a trade vessel 3 days outside compact space, beyond the reach of easy monitoring. What's happened? Doreen asked, already feeling her stomach tighten. Ambassador Kresh did not act alone in gathering his fleet, the queen said. He has spent the past 2 months quietly courting support from 3 other compact member species, the Voraxi, the Thelon Concord, and, I am ashamed to say, a faction within my own hive court, though the ruling queens have refused him. His argument to them is simple and, I fear, persuasive to those who fear change. That the compact's willingness to bend its ancient customs for your species threatens the stability of the entire order. That if humans are permitted to remain unbowed, other species long resentful of their place in the Circle's hierarchy will demand the same freedom, and the whole structure the compact has maintained for 6,000 years will begin to unravel. Is he building a coalition for war? Reyes asked sharply. He is attempting to, the queen said. So far, he has succeeded only with the Voraxi, who have committed 40 warships to his fleet, bringing his total force closer to 330. The Thelon Concord remains undecided, and my hive court's ruling queens have publicly condemned his actions, though I cannot say how long that position will hold if the situation escalates. I am telling you this, Ambassador Vance, because you treated my people with genuine respect during your months among us, something few outsiders have bothered to do, and because I believe, truly, that what Kresh is attempting is not justice for old wounds, but the beginning of something far more dangerous for every free species in this compact, not only yours. Does the first speaker know? Doreen asked. He knows of the fleet buildup, the queen said. I do not know whether he knows the full scope of Kresh's coalition building, nor how far it may yet spread. The first speaker is old, Ambassador Vance, and though he is respected, his patience for open warfare within the compact has made some of the younger elder houses question whether he still has the strength to hold the whole structure together. There are those who whisper that a war against your species, quick and decisive, would remind the compact why strength, not patience, has always been the true foundation of its order. Doreen exchanged a long look with Reyes. Thank you, she said finally, turning back to the queen. Truly, I know what it cost you to send this. Do not thank me yet, Ambassador, the queen clicked, and even through the strange chitinous mask of her face, Doreen thought she could hear something like genuine worry. Thank me if your people survive what is coming. I fear you have very little time left to prepare. The transmission cut out, and for a long moment, neither Doreen nor Reyes said anything at all. 330 ships, Reyes finally said quietly, and growing, if the Thelon Concord signs on too. We don't back down, Doreen said, though her voice was quieter now than it had been in the council chamber 3 days earlier. That hasn't changed. I know it hasn't, Reyes said, already turning toward the door, already calling up fleet deployment orders on his wrist display, his soldier's mind moving past fear and straight into the cold, practical work of preparing for what was coming. Doesn't mean I'm not scared, Doreen. Doesn't mean any of us should be. Being scared and standing firm were never supposed to be opposites. That's the whole point of the rule, isn't it? We bow to no one, not even to our own fear. Above them, through the wide windows of the council building, the night sky over Geneva was clear and full of stars, calm and distant and utterly indifferent to the fleet gathering somewhere far beyond them, closing, slowly but surely, on the fragile blue world that had refused, for 20 years, to kneel. In the days that followed, Earth changed in ways that were hard to see all at once, but impossible to miss, when Doreen stepped back and looked at the whole picture. Factories that had spent decades building civilian ships shifted, almost overnight, to producing weapons and armor plating instead. Universities suspended ordinary coursework, so that engineering students could spend their days retrofitting cargo haulers into makeshift warships under the guidance of naval architects. Farmers in a dozen countries began organizing supply chains to keep military bases fed through what everyone now understood might be a long and difficult siege. Nobody had ordered any of this in a single unified decree. It simply happened, the way it always seemed to happen in human history, whenever the stakes rose high enough. Millions of individual decisions all pointing, without any need for central command, toward the same stubborn goal. Doreen spent much of that time traveling between council sessions and military briefings, watching Reyes and his officers refine the defense plan again and again as fresh intelligence came in. She also spent time doing something that felt, in the middle of so much preparation for violence, strangely necessary: talking to ordinary people. She visited a shipyard outside what had once been called Rotterdam, where retired miners were teaching teenagers how to read asteroid density charts well enough to fly evasive patterns through the outer belts. She visited a hospital in Nairobi, where doctors were quietly training extra staff in case casualties from orbit needed to be brought planetside for treatment. Everywhere she went, she found the same mixture of fear and grim determination. People who understood exactly what might be coming and had decided, each in their own way, that bowing was still not an option worth considering. "Are you scared?" a young volunteer pilot asked her once, during a visit to a training facility in what had once been Texas, a woman barely out of her teens who had left university to fly one of the retrofitted mining haulers, now being converted for the coming fight. Doreen considered lying, considered offering some comforting, diplomatic answer, meant to steady the girl's nerves. She decided against it. "Yes," she said honestly, "I'm terrified. I think everyone who understands what's actually coming is terrified, and anyone who tells you otherwise either doesn't understand the stakes or is lying to make you feel better. But being scared isn't the same as being wrong, and it isn't the same as backing down. My grandmother used to tell me that courage was never about not being afraid. It was about doing the right thing anyway, even with your hands shaking. I think that's about the truest thing anyone's ever told me." The girl had nodded slowly, and a week later, when the call came for volunteer pilots to report to their assigned ships, she was among the first to answer. Word from Threnes, meanwhile, remained frustratingly thin. The first speaker had issued his formal demand for an accounting from the Sassoth Empire, and the demand had gone, publicly at least, unanswered. Privately, through the same careful channels that had brought the Crevice Queen's warning, Doreen learned that furious debates were underway among the Compact's elder houses, some arguing for immediate intervention against Kresh's growing fleet, others arguing, more cynically, that a distant human colony was not worth risking a wider war within the Compact itself. The first speaker, caught between these factions, had so far managed only to hold the Compact's official position at a careful, uneasy neutrality, watching and waiting, even as Doreen watched the fleet estimates on her tactical displays climb higher with each passing day. "He's not going to save us," Reyes said flatly, during one of their final planning sessions before the Sassoth fleet's projected arrival. "Whatever respect he has for you personally, Doreen, the first speaker answers to a compact full of elder houses who don't share it, and he can't move against one of his own member species without risking exactly the kind of internal war he's spent his entire long life trying to prevent. We plan as though nobody's coming to help us. If somebody does, we treat it as a blessing, but we don't build this defense around a rescue that might never arrive." Doreen had agreed, even as some small, stubborn part of her kept turning over the Crevice Queen's message, the promise, however small, that not every eye in the Compact had closed itself to what was happening. She did not know, in those final tense days before the fleet's arrival, whether that small hope would matter at all. She only knew that Earth's answer, whatever came next, was already decided, and had been decided, in truth, centuries before any of them had been born. The Sassoth fleet crossed into the outer boundary of the human system 11 days later, 330 warships moving in a formation so vast that Earth's deep space sensors first mistook it for a dense cluster of asteroids before the pattern resolved into something far more deliberate and far more terrifying. General Reyes received the alert at 0300 hours, standing in the underground command center beneath what had once been the Rocky Mountains, and within minutes, every human ship in the defense fleet was moving to its assigned position. The plan had been built over 11 days of frantic preparation, refined a dozen times as new intelligence came in, and it rested on a single, simple idea. Never let the Sassoth fleet fight the battle it wanted to fight. Earth's 40 capital ships did not gather in open space to meet the invaders head-on. Instead, they scattered, in small groups of 3 and 4, into the tangled asteroid belts and moon systems of the outer planets, where centuries of mining operations had left behind detailed maps of every rock, every gravitational eddy, every hidden channel through the debris that Sassoth navigation computers, built for open space warfare, had no data on at all. Alongside the capital ships went hundreds of smaller vessels, converted mining haulers, retrofitted cargo ships, anything with a hull and an engine that could be fitted with a weapon and a pilot willing to fly it. Humanity had spent 11 days turning half its civilian fleet into an irregular militia, and every single volunteer had known exactly what they were signing up for. Doreen watched the battle unfold from the command center, standing beside Reyes as reports came in, fragment by fragment, the tactical display filling with red icons pushing steadily inward from the system's edge. The Sassoth fleet, exactly as Reyes had predicted, tried to force a decisive engagement in open space first, pushing hard toward Earth's inner planets in a tight, disciplined formation, designed to overwhelm any defense fleet foolish enough to meet it directly. When no such fleet appeared, when instead the vast Sassoth formation found itself sailing into empty space with no target to strike, Kresh's commanders were forced to split their forces, sending smaller task groups into the asteroid belts to hunt down the scattered human ships hiding there. That was exactly what Reyes had been waiting for. "Now," he said quietly, and the order went out across 100 encrypted channels at once. What followed, over the next 6 hours, was not a battle in any traditional sense that the Sassoth commanders understood. It was 1,000 small ambushes, fought in the shadows of tumbling rocks, and inside the radiation-soaked gaps between colliding debris fields, where Sassoth sensor arrays struggled to distinguish a hidden warship from a chunk of nickel iron drifting on its own slow orbit. Human pilots who had spent years mining these same belts for a living now used that same intimate knowledge to strike and vanish, hitting Sassoth task groups from angles their targeting computers hadn't accounted for, then retreating deep into channels no outsider fleet could safely follow without risking a collision that would tear their hull apart. It was not a clean fight. Doreen watched, hands clenched into fists at her sides, as the tactical display marked human ship after human ship going dark, their icons flickering red before vanishing entirely. 40 capital ships became 31 by the 4th hour. The converted mining haulers fared even worse. Dozens of them lost in the first wave of skirmishes, their untrained volunteer crews paying the price for courage that outpaced experience. Every red flicker on that display was a ship, a crew, sons and daughters and mothers and fathers who had volunteered to fly into a war they had no guarantee of surviving, because the alternative was kneeling, and kneeling had never once, in all of human history, actually been the safer choice. But for every human ship lost, the Sassoth fleet paid a heavier price. Their capital ships, built for the crushing broadside exchanges of open warfare, proved sluggish and vulnerable in the tight confines of the asteroid channels, unable to bring their full weapon batteries to bear before a human strike craft had already fired and fled. By the 6th hour, Kresh's fleet had lost 41 warships, more than the Sassoth Empire had lost in the entire 300-year history of its membership in the Compact, and the disciplined formation that had crossed into the system 11 hours earlier had fractured into confused, scattered clusters, each one struggling to defend itself against an enemy that refused to appear where expected. It was at the 7th hour that Ambassador Kresh, aboard his flagship deep in the heart of the fractured fleet, made the decision that would define the rest of the war. "Enough of this," he snarled to his tactical officers, watching his own casualty reports climb with a fury that had long since curdled into something closer to desperation. "Pull every remaining ship back into a single formation. We drive straight for their homeworld. If we cannot win this war among the rocks, we will win it by making their capital burn until they beg us to stop." The order went out, and across the fractured human system, 300 remaining Sassoth warships began, slowly and painfully, to regroup, abandoning the asteroid hunt entirely and turning their combined bow toward Earth itself. Reyes saw the shift in formation the moment it began, and his face went pale in the dim light of the command center. "He's done fighting our way," he said grimly. "He's going for the throat." "Can we stop him?" Doreen asked. "We're about to find out," Reyes said, already sending new orders across the fleet channels, calling every remaining human ship back from the outer belts, converging on a single, desperate final position between the advancing Sassoth fleet and the blue and white world both of them were fighting for. "Every ship we have left, converge on Earth orbit. This is it. This is the line." The final battle for Earth orbit lasted 11 minutes. It felt, to everyone who lived through it on the ground, like 11 years. 289 Sassoth warships bore down on a defense line of 22 human capital ships, and what remained of the militia fleet, barely 60 vessels in total, and for the first 4 minutes, it seemed as though nothing, not courage, not cleverness, not the stubborn refusal to bow that had brought humanity to this moment, would be enough to stop what was coming. Human ships died in droves, their shields overwhelmed by the sheer volume of incoming fire, their hulls breached and their crews lost to the cold vacuum in numbers that made even Reyes, standing in his underground bunker with decades of command experience behind him, go silent, with something close to despair. And then, at the 4-minute mark, something happened that no one, not Reyes, not Doreen, not a single soul in the unified council, had planned for. Ships began arriving from beyond the system's edge, not human ships, crevice warships, their insectile hulls unmistakable even at extreme range, followed moments later by a smaller contingent bearing the pale, drifting silhouette of Ulun vessels, gel tanks visible through their transparent outer hulls, even in the chaos of battle. And behind them, unmistakably, impossibly, came a fleet flying the deep bronze colors of the HFY Compact itself, the first speaker's own personal banner at its head. "This is First Speaker Doran, commanding the combined relief fleet of the HFY Compact," came a transmission, broadcast on every channel, human and Sassoth alike, the old HFY's voice, carrying a weight and fury that Doreen had never heard from him before, not even in their first meeting in the Grand Hall. "Ambassador Kresh, you have led an unsanctioned war against a species under this compact's protection, in direct defiance of my explicit warning 11 days ago. You have dragged the Voraxi into your reckless ambitions and threatened the stability of an order that has held 6,000 years of peace between 100 worlds. This ends now. Stand down your fleet, or every ship you have remaining will be destroyed where it stands, and the Sassoth Empire's seat in this circle will be forfeit for a generation." For a long, terrible moment, nothing happened. The Sassoth fleet held its position, weapons still hot, still trained on the battered remains of Earth's defense line, and Doreen found herself holding her breath, watching the tactical display with a kind of desperate, disbelieving hope. Then, one by one, the red icons of the Sassoth fleet began to power down their weapon systems. Ambassador Kresh's flagship was the last to stand down, and when his face finally appeared on the command center's main display, transmitted not to Doreen or Reyes, but broadcast across the entire compact network for every member species to witness, there was nothing left in his expression but exhausted, bitter defeat. "You have won this battle, Ambassador Vance," he said, his voice flat, drained of the fury that had carried him this far. "I hope, for your species' sake, that you understand what it has truly cost you." "I know exactly what it cost us," Doreen said quietly, thinking of the red icons that had flickered and vanished across the tactical display over the past 7 hours, the crews who would never come home. "I'll be thinking about that cost for the rest of my life, Ambassador Kresh. But I want you to understand something too, before this is over. We didn't win this because we're stronger than you. We won it because we refused to be anything less than what we are. And because it turns out that's worth fighting for, even against odds like yours. That's the whole rule. It was never complicated. We bow to no one, not to kings, not to tyrants, and not to you." The transmission cut, and in the sudden quiet of the command center, Doreen finally allowed herself to sit down, her legs no longer entirely steady beneath her, and looked up at the tactical display, where the battered remains of humanity's defense fleet drifted in silent, exhausted formation, above a world that, against every terrible odd, still belonged entirely to itself. The hours that followed were a blur of activity, reports flooding in from every corner of the system, as the scale of the battle's cost became clear. Of the 40 capital ships that had begun the engagement, only 19 remained combat-capable. The militia fleet had suffered even worse, barely a third of its converted mining haulers surviving the 7 hours of fighting in the asteroid belts, and the desperate 11 minutes above Earth itself. Reyes moved through the command center, giving orders in a steady, controlled voice, but Doreen could see the toll the numbers were taking on him, the way his jaw tightened every time a new casualty report crossed his desk. She spent that first night not sleeping, but sitting in the small viewing gallery above the command center, watching through a reinforced window as recovery shuttles moved slowly through the debris field that had, only hours earlier, been a battlefield. Somewhere out there, in the cold dark, families were about to receive the news that changes a life forever, and there was nothing Doreen could do from where she sat, except sit with the weight of it, and try to hold on to the reason it had been necessary at all. Tobrun contacted her 2 days later, his image flickering slightly on the display, the first time she had spoken with him since her hurried departure from Threnis 11 days earlier. "The first speaker asked me to relay his personal thanks," Tobrun said. "He knows the cost your people paid was far higher than his relief fleet's arrival should have allowed. He wishes you to know that the delay was not from lack of will, but from the difficulty of moving 3 elder houses to authorize military action against a fellow member species. It took the Crevice Queen's testimony before the full Council of Elders, and considerable political risk on her part, to finally break the deadlock." "Tell her I said thank you," Doreen said quietly. "Tell her I'll never forget what she did." "I will," Tobrun said. "Ambassador Vance, Doreen, I must also tell you something the first speaker has not yet made public. The Voraxi commitment of 40 ships to Kresh's fleet was discovered, in the final accounting, to have been arranged through bribery of a junior Voraxi minister, not through any official sanction of their ruling council. When this became known, the Voraxi government moved swiftly to recall their remaining ships, and has already begun its own internal investigation. I suspect their censure, when it is formally announced, will be considerably lighter than what awaits the Sassoth Empire." "That seems fair," Doreen said. "They were misled into this as much as anything. Kresh built his whole coalition on old grievances and half-truths. I don't think that makes what happened right, but I understand it better than I understand what drove Kresh himself." "Kresh believed, genuinely, that he was defending something larger than himself," Tobrun said. "That is what makes him dangerous, and it is also, strangely, what makes him almost understandable. He watched his people submit 300 years ago, watched every generation since raised on the shame of that submission, and when he saw a species refusing to submit at all and somehow thriving because of it, I think it broke something in him that had been fragile for a very long time. He could not bear the thought that his ancestors' surrender might have been unnecessary. Easier, perhaps, to believe your species simply had not yet learned the lesson his had learned so painfully." Doreen thought about that for a long time after the transmission ended, sitting alone in the quiet of the command center's viewing gallery. She thought about Kresh's bitter, exhausted face on the final transmission, and found, to her own surprise, that beneath the anger she still carried for every life lost in the battle, there was room for something like pity too. A species that had never been allowed to believe submission was a choice, rather than a permanent, unchangeable fact of survival, would of course find it unbearable to watch another species prove otherwise. It did not excuse what he had done, but it helped her understand it, and understanding, she had learned over years of difficult diplomacy, was very often the first small step toward something better than endless cycles of resentment and war. 3 weeks after the battle's end, the Unified Council held a memorial ceremony in Geneva for every crew member lost in the defense of Earth orbit, human, and, at the first speaker's quiet request, the small number of compact relief fleet personnel who had also given their lives in the battle's final minutes. Doreen stood before the gathered crowd, thousands strong, with representatives from every nation on Earth present, and read the names, one by one, until her voice grew hoarse and the sun had begun to set behind the mountains beyond the city. When the last name had been read, she looked out over the silent crowd and said the only thing she felt she had any right to say. "They did not die so that we could win a war," she told them. "They died so that we could remain exactly who we have always insisted on being. I hope," for the rest of my life, that we prove it was worth what it cost. The grand hall of the HFY Compact was fuller than Doreen Vance had ever seen it, 6 months after the battle that the news feeds of 100 worlds had already started calling the Siege of Seoul. Every seat in the circle was occupied, and more delegates than usual stood crowded near the great doors, drawn by word that something historic was about to happen, though few of them yet knew exactly what. Doreen walked down the long central aisle, the same way she had walked it the very first time, boots clicking against black stone, spine straight, chin level. But this time, she was not alone. Beside her walked General Marcus Reyes, in his dress uniform, a chest full of ribbons he never talked about pinned neatly above his heart. And behind them both, at a respectful distance, walked 6 more human representatives, chosen from across the unified council, to witness what came next. The Sassoth seat in the circle sat empty. Ambassador Kresh had been recalled in disgrace within a week of the battle's end, and the Sassoth Empire itself had spent the past 6 months under a formal compact censure, stripped of its voting rights in the circle, and required, under terms the first speaker himself had negotiated, to pay reparations to every human family that had lost someone in the war. It was not a punishment humanity had asked for. Doreen had argued against it, actually, in 3 separate closed sessions with the elder houses, on the grounds that a broken and humiliated Sassoth Empire would only breed the next generation of Kresh-like resentment. But the elder houses had insisted, and in the end, the first speaker had sided with them, though he had promised Doreen quietly, afterward, that the censure would not last forever, and that the door back to full standing would remain open the moment the Sassoth people chose new leadership willing to walk through it. The Voraxi delegation, seated near the edge of the circle, would not meet Doreen's eyes as she passed. Their 40 ships lost in the battle had cost them dearly too, and their own censure, though lighter than the Sassoth Empire's, had left deep scars in their pride. Doreen felt no satisfaction looking at them. She felt only the same tired grief she had carried since the battle's end, the weight of every human life lost, etched permanently into whatever peace had followed. At the center of the circle stood the empty seat. It had sat empty for 20 years and 6 months now, pale stone beneath its small plaque reading Earth, unchanged through everything that had happened around it. Doreen stopped in front of it and looked up at the first speaker, seated once more on his high dais, his ancient bronze face unreadable in the hall's shifting light. "Ambassador Vance," he said, his voice carrying easily across the silent hall. "6 months ago, your people fought a war they did not seek, against odds they should not have survived, and did not bow, not once, not even when the outcome hung by the thinnest of threads. I have spoken with every elder house in this compact in the time since. I have listened to arguments from those who believe your species' stubbornness nearly cost this circle its stability, and I have listened to arguments from those who believe your species has shown this compact something it had genuinely forgotten after 6,000 years of unbroken order. I find myself, even now, uncertain which argument holds more truth. Perhaps both do." He rose from his throne and descended the long stairs, exactly as he had the very first time they had met, until he stood before her, close enough that the whole hall fell utterly silent to hear what came next. "I am not going to ask you to sit in that seat, Ambassador Vance," he said. "I gave up on that particular hope some time ago, and I confess, watching what your people did to defend their right to remain standing, I am no longer entirely certain I wish for it to change. But I am going to ask you something else instead, on behalf of every species gathered in this hall today." "Ask, first speaker," Doreen said. "Will humanity remain part of this compact?" The first speaker asked, and there was something almost vulnerable in the question, an old and powerful being asking a much younger species for something he could not simply command. Not as a member seated in the circle, bound by the customs that seat requires, but as a free and equal partner, standing outside the traditions of 6,000 years, trading with us, learning from us, fighting beside us when the need arises, exactly as you offered on the very first day we met. Will you stay, even though this compact could not spare you the cost of the war you fought to remain who you are?" Doreen looked around the vast hall, at the crevice queens who had sent ships to Earth's defense at the risk of their own hive court's disapproval. At the Ulun delegation, whose gel tank philosophers had spent months teaching her people the deep mathematics of faster-than-light navigation. At the countless other species who had watched, over 6 months, as humanity refused to become anything other than exactly what it had always insisted on being. "We'll stay," she said. "Not because this compact is perfect, first speaker. It isn't. We've seen its flaws as clearly as anyone, maybe more clearly, given what those flaws nearly cost us. But we've also seen, in this hall and beyond it, that there are enough people here, enough different, strange, wonderful people, who believe a species can be part of something larger than itself, without giving up what makes it itself in the first place. That's worth staying for. That's worth building something better around, together, one trade agreement and one shared discovery at a time." The first speaker's 4 eyes blinked slowly, and something in his ancient face, weathered by 6,000 years of careful diplomacy, softened into an expression Doreen had never seen from him before, not once, in all their months of difficult conversations. "Then let the record of this circle show," he said, turning to address the full gathered hall, his voice rising to fill every corner of the vast chamber, "that on this day, the human seat in the circle of the HFY compact remains, by mutual and permanent agreement, empty, not as a mark of exclusion, but as a mark of respect, the first and only seat in 6,000 years of this compact's history, to be left deliberately unfilled, in recognition of a species that taught this circle something it had genuinely forgotten, that there is more than one way to belong, that strength and stubbornness are not always the same as arrogance, and that a rule, once truly earned through blood and sacrifice, does not bend simply because the cost of keeping it turns out to be high." A murmur ran through the gathered delegates, not the uneasy murmur of Doreen's first visit to this hall, but something warmer, something that in 100 different alien throats, and translated through 100 different devices, sounded remarkably, unmistakably, like respect. That evening, back aboard the human transport ship preparing for the long journey home, Doreen stood at the observation deck with General Reyes, watching the ring-shaped station of Threnis shrink slowly behind them, its lights bright against the dying red star it orbited. 20 years and 6 months, Reyes said quietly, standing beside her. That's how long that seat sat empty, before anybody really understood why. Funny how long it can take the universe to catch up to something a species already knew about itself. "We didn't always know it either," Doreen said. "Not really. Not until we were forced to prove it. That's the thing about a rule like ours, Marcus. It's easy to believe in when nobody's testing it. It only really becomes true the moment it costs you something to keep it." "You think it was worth it?" Reyes asked. And there was no challenge in the question, only the quiet, honest weight of a man who had ordered ships full of young volunteers into a battle some of them had not survived. "All of it? Every life we lost?" Doreen was quiet for a long moment, watching the stars shift slowly outside the viewport, thinking of the empty seat in the grand hall, of the crevice queen, who had risked her own standing to warn them, of the first speaker's ancient, weathered face finally softening into something like respect. "I think," she said finally, "that some things are worth protecting, even when protecting them costs everything you have. I think humanity spent most of its history learning that lesson the hard way, kneeling to people who never deserved it, until enough of us, in enough different places, finally said no more, whatever the cost. And I think, 6 months ago, we proved to the whole galaxy that we meant it. Not with words this time, with everything we had." She turned from the viewport and looked at Reyes, and for the first time since the battle's end, something like genuine peace settled over her tired, worn features. "That seat's going to stay empty for a long time, Marcus," she said. "Maybe forever. And every single time some new species asks why, somebody's going to have to tell them the whole story, start to finish, war and all. I think that's exactly how it should be. Some rules are worth being famous for. Ours is one of them." Outside the viewport, the stars stretched on forever, indifferent and endless, and somewhere among them, 11 light hours from a small, stubborn blue and white world, an empty stone seat sat waiting in a hall 6,000 years old, a quiet reminder to every species that would ever walk through those doors, that there was, and always would be, one small, unbreakable rule, that humanity would carry with it to the very edge of the galaxy and beyond. The years that followed were not without difficulty. Doreen would spend the rest of her career navigating the slow, uneven work of building genuine trust between Earth and the wider compact, work that never moved as quickly or as cleanly as she might have wished. The Sassoth Empire's censure lasted almost 4 years before new leadership, a younger generation that had grown up watching the cost of Kresh's ambitions, finally petitioned for readmission to full standing. Doreen herself argued strongly in their favor when the vote came before the elder houses, a decision that surprised many who remembered how close Kresh's fleet had come to burning her homeworld from orbit. "Grudges don't build anything," she told a young council aide who asked her about it once, years later. "They just wait around for the next excuse to burn something down. I'd rather spend my energy building something that lasts." The Creva's queen, who had risked her hive court's disapproval to warn humanity of Kresh's coalition, became, over the following years, one of Earth's closest allies in the compact, and the trade agreements Doreen personally negotiated between their two peoples became a model that other species eventually studied and adapted for their own dealings with humanity. The Ulan philosophers, delighted by what they called humanity's productive stubbornness, established the first joint research station between their species, a floating laboratory built in the gas giant belt beyond Jupiter, where gel tank scholars and human scientists worked side by side, unraveling problems neither species could have solved alone. Earth itself changed too, in the slow, permanent way that surviving something enormous always changes a place. Every year, on the anniversary of the battle, cities across the world held quiet ceremonies, remembering those who had been lost, not with parades or triumphant speeches, but with simple, solemn gatherings that focused less on victory and more on what the victory had actually cost. Schoolchildren learned the story of the Siege of Seoul not as a tale of glorious conquest, but as a reminder of exactly how expensive principle could be and exactly why it remained worth defending anyway. General Reyes retired from active command 5 years after the battle, though he remained, until the end of his long life, a close friend and advisor to Doreen and to the unified council that followed her. He was fond, in his later years, of telling a particular story to young officers training in the very same academy where the volunteer pilot Doreen had once spoken to had first learned to fly. It was the story of a girl who had asked an ambassador, on the eve of the worst battle in human history, whether she was scared, and the honest answer she had received in return. Courage was never about not being afraid, he would tell them, echoing words Doreen had said to him more than once over the years. It's about doing the right thing anyway, with your hands shaking. Every single one of you will feel that fear someday, if you serve long enough. What matters is what you do with your hands while they're shaking. Doreen Vance herself lived to see humanity's seat remain empty for over 40 years, through 3 more first speakers, after the one who had first extended his hand across the Grand Hall, through wars fought and avoided, alliances built and occasionally broken, and through the slow, steady growth of a species that had once feared the stars might swallow it whole, and instead found, standing exactly as it always had, that the stars had room enough for those who refused to kneel. Near the end of her life, on a visit back to Threnis for what would be her final formal address before the circle, an old alien delegate she did not recognize approached her in the halls outside the Grand Hall, a young Sassoth diplomat, she realized after a moment, born long after the war, raised in the more open era that had followed the Empire's eventual return to full compact standing. "Ambassador Vance," the young Sassoth said, bowing his head slightly in a gesture Doreen recognized, with some surprise, as genuine respect rather than the old formal submission his people had once been forced to perform. "I wanted to thank you. My grandfather fought in Kresh's fleet during the Siege of Seoul. He spoke of it, before he died, as the day he finally understood that submission was never the only alternative to destruction, that there was a third path, one built on respect freely given, instead of respect demanded. My whole generation grew up believing that, because your people proved it was possible." Doreen looked at him for a long moment, this young diplomat from a species that had once been her people's most dangerous enemy, now standing before her with nothing but quiet gratitude in his reptilian eyes, and felt something settle deep in her chest that she had been waiting, without quite realizing it, to feel for nearly 40 years. "Tell your grandfather's story to your own children," she said gently. That's how a lesson like that stays learned. Not through the seat that stays empty, or the treaties, or the speeches, through the stories we choose to keep telling, long after the people who lived them are gone. She walked past the young diplomat and into the grand hall one final time, past the pale stone seat with its small plaque, still empty after all these years, and took her place at the center of the circle, standing tall, exactly as she always had, ready to speak. We bow to no one,